Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us. As you know, in November, the United Kingdom will host the 26th Annual United Nations Global Climate Summit called the Conference of the Parties in Glasgow. Most experts agree that the window for limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels is rapidly closing. And the decade up to 2030 will be the most critical yet to achieving this target. This gives COP26 a unique urgency as countries are being asked to submit their updated national climate plans, setting targets for mitigating greenhouse gas emissions and adapting to climate impacts. The stated objectives of this year's conference are: 1, to secure global net zero by mid-century, that's 2050, and keep 1.5 degrees warming within reach. Countries are being asked to come forward with ambitious 2030 emissions reductions targets that align with reaching net zero by the middle of the century, including their plans to phase out coal, curtail deforestation, speed up the switch to electric vehicles, and encourage investment in renewables. Second, adapt to protect communities and natural habitats. Countries are being asked to work together to protect and restore vulnerable ecosystems and build defenses and early warning systems to avoid loss of homes, livelihoods, and lives. 3, mobilize finance. Developed countries are being asked to make good on their promise to mobilize at least $100 billion in climate finance per year to help assist developing nations transition to low carbon economies and mitigate the impact of climate change. It's not overstating the case to say that climate change is perhaps the most critical challenge confronting Africa this century. The continent contributes just 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions, yet is shouldered with the greatest burden in transitioning to low carbon economies and is the most vulnerable to climate shocks. We are already seeing the impacts of these climate shocks on our continent, from increased droughts and flooding to climate-induced conflict and political instability, which often have the most severe effects on vulnerable groups such as women, children, and the elderly, especially in regions with high poverty levels and high levels of displacement as a result of effects. All in all, climate change is challenging our ability as a continent to meet our development goals and build a prosperous future for African citizens, which is what we all really want to see. Given these harsh realities, our question today, and the question that we're so glad you've joined us to help answer, is what should be at the top of Africa's agenda at COP26? And over the last month, Good Governance Africa have been running a campaign under our Wicked Conversation series, which looks to better understand the many key issues at stake when it comes to climate change in Africa and the multifaceted solutions required to meet this challenge. So today, as part of this series and in partnership with Mail and Guardian, we've convened several experts to help us answer this question. I'm going to introduce them. They are then going to deliver their opening remarks. And then I'm going to moderate a Q&A session, and I'd love to ask you to please use the chat function to ask questions. In case any of you were wondering, by the way, and sorry, my apologies, I should have said this at the beginning. If you were expecting to see Chris Maroleng, who's our executive director, he had to deal with an emergency, and so I am taking his place. It's a great privilege for me to be able to do so. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from our panelists. First up, I'm going to invite Romy Chevalier to join us. Romy is a former colleague and a close friend, and I'm very grateful, Romy, for your time today. Romy is an independent consultant and a senior researcher still within the South African Institute of International Affairs Governance of Africa's Resources Program. She's worked on various policy topics related to the EU's strategic engagement with Africa and South Africa, the role of emerging powers in a changing geopolitical landscape, climate change, natural resource governance, and environmental sustainability. more broadly. After Romy, I'm going to call on Dr. Prabhat Upadhyaya, who's a senior policy analyst in climate and plastics at the Worldwide Fund for Nature, WWF, South Africa. He works at the interface of policy research and policy advocacy from a governance perspective for advancing institutional responses to the climate crisis and plastic pollution that are locally contextualized. Prabhat serves as deputy chair at the South African Climate Action Network board and as an associate editor at the newly launched journal Climate Action. Friends, colleagues, thank you so much for joining us today. Romy, if I could invite you to make your opening remarks, and as a kind of prefacing question, given that we know some of the work you do, could you please speak to how Africa's environmental and development needs are often framed as mutually exclusive? I'm sorry, because I've actually read the wrong question. My apologies.
I can do that too.
Just as I was reading that, I thought, I know Romy, and I know that this is part of what she does, but this doesn't quite match. My apologies. Romy, please could you provide some insights into the work you're doing on the AU Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan for 22 to 2030, and some of the major challenges around developing and implementing major regional climate change strategies.
Perfect. Thank you, Ross. I'll take over. Thank you very much, and thank you for hosting me on this platform today to discuss an obviously very, very important and pertinent topic. So in the lead up to COP26, which starts next week, I just want to start by kind of maybe setting the scene a little bit to discuss why COP26 is such an important milestone in terms of climate negotiations. Obviously, these negotiations have been going on for many years. I think almost 25 COPs have taken place to date. But why these events are, and they generally take place obviously every year. Last year, we skipped the COP because of COVID issues. But they're at a point in time where all eyes focus on climate action, and essentially gives the world the opportunity to kind of look at what's been done thus far in terms of climate pledges, what's needed to ensure the momentum continues in terms of global pledges to 1.5, which we all, degrees target that we're all looking to achieve, and just to and look to see what emissions gap are in place and how to get there. And obviously, COP is not only about kind of the economic and environmental imperatives that we all have as countries, but there's a lot of politics and issues behind the scenes that countries also need to address. It's obviously an enormous task, one that requires collective action from all countries. So no one country can face this alone. And obviously that's why a multilateral setting such as the COP is such a pertinent environment for such discussions. From the Africa perspective, obviously 55 countries have very different member countries and very different member country concerns and circumstances. But it's important that Africa, and it does do this, it speaks as a bloc under the Africa Group of Negotiators, and there's a structure we can talk about later about how they come up with common positions. But essentially they align around certain agenda items that are key for the continent in terms of pursuing the development, environmental and socioeconomic imperatives of Africa. So for this year, there are numerous agenda items of the African group that they've put specifically on the table. There were meetings preceding this COP where negotiators came together at the ministerial and heads of state level and decided what were the key negotiating points that negotiators were going to push for. There were some issues that they feel very strongly about, others where they obviously are happy to make a little bit more leeway, but such as negotiations go. But the thing that I want to point out first, just in terms of what's expected on the agenda, before I get to the African strategy that Ross has asked me to speak to, is this COP is particularly important for the updating and the strengthening of emissions contributions from countries. So in climate change speak, we call these the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs. And these are the documents that are self-determined plans that where a country lays out what commitments it's going to put in place to reduce greenhouse gases, and also what plans it's putting in place to make communities resilient to climate change impacts and to adapt to the effects of impacts. And these are supposedly providing the detailed roadmap on commitments stakeholder groupings so that everybody can get behind them and implement them at the country level. Now, why this is important is because there's a deadline. This is the year, COP26 is the official deadline for this revision and strengthening of NDCs. There was an initial submission, and every 5 years after the initial submission, NDCs are to be revised and strengthened, with the idea that every iteration shows increasing ambition. And that is the actual headline or the title of this COP is, it's an ambition COP. And the idea is that if we look at what's been contributed collectively to date, it does not meet the ambition that we need as the globe in terms of what the science is saying that we need in terms of getting us to 1.5, which we know for a continent like Africa will have drastic and long lasting effects. So for Africa, these NDCs are really, really important. And NDCs globally, there's so I think when the NDC report came out, the UNFCCC at the end of last year, there were 114 countries, I think, that had submitted a revised NDCs, of which some showed no increasing ambition. Others showed increasing ambition, but they were only proposals and intentions. And what's really important is that there's a goal from every country that they are ambitious in terms of their own self-determined goals, but that these move beyond just being proposals and intentions, and they're actually legislated in country so that there is action, and that there's an implementation plan that is associated with these NDCs to show how countries are going to go about implementing these targets. What's really important about NDCs is that they're the stepping stones and the building blocks towards longer term timeframes. So Ross mentioned these 2050 goals of decarbonizing our society. And we're all working towards these, but these NDCs are the kind of the shorter term iterations. And if they're not ambitious enough, it means we're heading on the wrong trajectory. So I think it's very important to just take note of that COP26 is going to be very much focused on ambition around these NDCs. NDCs are also mostly conditional. So they're conditional on finance and other means of support, which means that at COP26, if we don't make progress on climate finance, these NDCs aren't going anywhere, which means that then obviously this ambition won't be progressive and implemented. So that's another obviously very contentious and important issue on the table for COP26, specifically for the developing world and for Africa, which actually calls for 50% of this finance to go towards adaptation. This brings me to my last point around the COP agenda, is that COP26 from an Africa perspective is primarily focused on adaptation and resilience building. And we can speak a little bit more about what that looks like. In terms of, Ross, would you like me to answer now the strategy or go into that a little bit later? I know
I think that now is good. I'm very glad to see that we've been joined by Dr. Britta Renkamp as well. So, but Romy, yes, please. I think let's bring it up now.
Okay, perfect.
I'm taking notes, so we'll come back to any.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And there's obviously a lot of issues, and these issues are very complex. So this is just a kind of a quick overview of some of the issues, and obviously my panelists will also touch on some of these. But just in terms of the Africa Union climate change strategy, so the Africa Union as a bloc compromises of all member countries of the African Union. So it's 55 countries. And essentially, we know that all African Union member countries have their own national climate change policies and plans. So, for example, we can reflect on what South Africa is doing, and we can discuss around what South Africa's ambition and commitments have looked like to date. And all other countries on the continent obviously have their plans too. But there is a need, and has been a need for a long time, for kind of a unified document that sets out some of these common denominator challenges and opportunities for the continent. So it won't have necessarily it won't be a mandatory document. It is a document where countries kind of describe their unified prospects around climate change and around climate action. And it's a document where they can coordinate actions around all stakeholder groupings on the continent. So at the moment, it's actually just a draft. It's being submitted for validation at the end of this year. But the idea is that there is a 10-year action plan that all country and member countries will get behind. And the idea is that over this next 10 years, it sets out kind of the key intervention and action areas for the continent on various issues. And what it also does, it identifies kind of the key development pathways that look to link sustainable development, climate change together. And they're looking at pathways that will catalyze socioeconomic transformation. So we can go into the different sectors because it covers everything from food systems, blue oceans, biodiversity and land use management, digital transformation, et cetera, cities, everything. But these kind of system approaches, but I'm not going to go into the detail of now, but essentially it is a very important document to ensure that everybody's on board. And it's aligned with the kind of African agenda for 2063, which sets out certain goals. I'll stop there, Russ, and we can talk about it if there's interest.
Great, Romeo. Thanks very much. I'm most certainly going to come back to this question of how a continental level strategy lands at the local level, and how local domestic politics plays a role in shaping the extent to which countries commit to these ambitions. Great. Thank you, Romy.
My pleasure.
Move next to Dr. Prabhat Upadhyaya, who's joined us from the WWF. And just to note that Dr. Britta Renkamp has joined us as well. The only speaker who hasn't been able to join us is Dr. Nicholas King, who I think is facing load shedding issues in rural KZN. So if he is able to jump on, he will. And it looks like I've just lost...
I'm here. Just my video is not there. It will come back.
All right. Well, it's fine. While we wait for your video to come on, Dr. Prabhat, please could you speak to how Africa's environmental and development needs are often framed as mutually exclusive, and the impact that this has on international climate negotiations and operationalizing climate strategies in Africa. You'll have heard Romy obviously refer to some of these questions around adaptation and how we kind of secure finance, and NDCs being contingent or conditional on securing finance. Perhaps you could speak to the imperative to actually move ahead with these ambitions, perhaps even in the absence of this finance being forthcoming. Over to you, sir.
Sure. Thanks very much. So Remy has touched on some important points. So in my response, I will build on some of them. But the question starting with that, how Africa's environment and development needs are often painted as exclusive. The key example is the argument for example, in South Africa's case, oh, but we have so much coal that's left, right? We can use that. A quick response is we didn't come out of the Stone Age for the lack of stones, right? So it's not that which determines whether we move ahead. But having said that, it's a fallacy, it's a binary which we very easily fall into, that we have to choose one over another. And I think it's dangerous at the stage where we are to choose one over other. In a way that, given that in last 2-3 decades of inaction on climate change, we have now reached at a point where the temperatures have increased. The climate or weather, the local weather, has sort of been weaponized in the sense that we are seeing the impact on the ground, right? So the environment as we know it is not a passive entity anymore. It is now responding back, and it's responding very unpredictably in a variety of ways. So then the question becomes that our development is not operating, or we can't continue developing in isolation of how environment is impacting it. So if you look at World Economic Forum's recent reports on the risk survey, so a lot of the investors now look at extreme weather events as the single biggest risk by likelihood for the last 5 years continuously. So which means sudden rainfall events, etc., they can actually threaten the development. So even this year we have seen as heat domes that suddenly came in Canada and US. People actually died. This is not Delhi, or this is not India. We are talking of Canada and US, right? Then there was rains in Germany and towns. I think it's in northwest or west of Germany, where infrastructure couldn't withstand. So a lot of the time, the argument we have heard is, oh, the climate change is going to impact vulnerable countries or developing countries. But what it shows is that even developed countries are not equipped to handle the unpredictability and intensity of the climate change. So these are developed countries, their infrastructure is not able to withstand the impact of climate. So that raises a question that you cannot develop your way out of climate change, right? You can't just assume that let's develop and we will then sort out the environment issues. So these need to be sorted out together. And I think there we need to start thinking of the narrative. So I'll pause there, but I'll then pick on Remy's point, and then this point will come in there. So Remy, and that's a bit out of my comfort zone on adaptation. So linking back to the theme of the topic that, what's be at the top of Africa's agenda for this COP, I think one of the key issues for Africa is reaching an agreement on global goal on adaptation, right? So how does everybody agree how we adapt to climate change, given that the recent science tells that a certain amount of climate change is here to stay, so we need to adapt. But bearing in mind that agreement is not enough, we just have to look at Paris Agreement, which we agreed in 2015, and where we are. Just agreement is not enough. We need to have enabling conditions to implement it, to get it going. So what are those? So for me, those are four of those. First one is that we need resources in terms of financial support. USD 100 billion is on the table, but the recent needs assessment shows that's not even peanuts. It's essentially empty peanut shells, right? So the needs of developing countries run in trillions of US dollars. But anyways, we are stuck with US $100 billion. So we have to make sure that of that, at least 50% is flowing for adaptation, and a substantial part of it comes from public sources, so grants, etc. So that's one in terms of finance. Secondly, we need to see practical models where environment and development coexist, where they work together and we achieve both of them simultaneously. And then the third point, which I had actually paused, that it flows in there, we need to start framing our conversations about how we can achieve both. So it's not just models, but we also need to start talking about it in a way and influence the narrative and start seeing of investment in environment and nature as an insurance for development, so that we do not see it standing aloof, but actually it's our investment. It's sort of our pension fund. It's sort of our health insurance. It's sort of our life insurance. If we do not do that, then our development will be continually undermined by climate impact. And then finally would be enhancing capacity for implementation of all the plans that we are making. So at the continental level, given that we have limited institutional capacity, that becomes important. And I'm assuming that Britta will delve deeper into that particular point. So that's from my side. And then I would say looking beyond COP, there are two things which Africa really need to think strongly and carefully about already at this point. The next COP, COP27, is going to be in Egypt, in Africa. So that's the African COP, so to say. So we need to make sure that when we leave COP26, we do not leave the process out in tatters for us to then pick up the pieces and start all over again. So we need to find ways to retain and build trust in this process. And we are just a few days from COP, and that seems to be a rare commodity in the process right now. So that's one. How do we bring back trust into the process? The second is, I think, a more practical point, that how do we take lessons for holding such meetings in a hybrid environment, so learning from UK presidency, what worked, what didn't work, but also noting that not all African countries, the infrastructure or internet connectivity rate is not that great. So how are we going to hold that in an African country? So I would stop there, but touching on these points which link to each other, but also building on Remy's point. Thanks.
Very good. Yeah, Prabhat, thank you so much. I really appreciate your opening remarks. One of the things, of course, that you've alerted us to here is this important point that development is dependent on ecological sustainability. There is no such thing as further economic development unless we have sustainable ecological environments in which to live. And I liked your phrase that investment in ecological sustainability is essentially an insurance policy for the future. Now, of course, not all countries necessarily view it this way. And as you rightly said at the beginning, there are those who would say, well, we have coal, surely we're entitled to use it. Rich countries don't preach to us from the position of luxury now of having degraded the environment, built up huge levels of wealth from which you now preach at us. and you're saying, hey, we actually need to start changing that mindset, regardless or even despite the hypocrisy. And of course, it raises questions around just transition. So I'd like to transition to Dr. Britta Renkamp. Dr. Renkamp, thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Renkamp, I wonder if you could then, in your opening remarks, touch on some of the key political and economic issues around this question of energy transitions, a just transition on the continent, and how they relate to Africa's environmental and development needs, and how that fits into the overall context of what we're trying to achieve as a globe, but also as a continent at COP26. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for the welcome. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and
okay,
clear.
Great. Yeah, so firstly, my apologies. The internet went off in my house, so I had to run to the hotel next door. So I'm in a public space now, so apologies if there are any background noises. Yeah, transitions and just transitions. Yeah, very important topic in Africa, South Africa, Southern Africa particularly. Let me just cover some groundwork. So we have been talking about a just transition a lot recently in South Africa, but also in Europe and other parts of the world. I don't think there's such thing as a just transition. So I think we need to just think about transitions in terms of socio-technical transitions very carefully. So we need to think, okay, climate change, we have the climate crisis. What is it that we need in terms of technology? And what is it that we need to change? So technology is not just an artifact. It always is a product of a society in time. Societies build technologies, societies use technologies, adapt technologies. So it's a socio-technical transition. Now the justice aspect comes into it later in a way. So it's obviously an important component of a transition, but it might, technical transitions or socio-technical transition might happen anyway, so they might not necessarily be all that just. And justice is obviously also very subjective term of what is considered as just or not. So I'd like to think of this more in terms of social justice within socio-technical transitions, and look very carefully of what these transitions actually involve. Now, I think the term was mainly coined through the industrialized countries who built their wealth mainly on coal and fossil fuels, and exiting those energy sources now towards more renewable and cleaner technologies, and thinking about the job implications in that. So what happens to workers who are on those traditional sectors in fossil fuels? How can they be redeployed, put into different sectors and sustain their livelihoods? So there's a transition, there are transitions built into these technologies now. Some of this mirrors with where we are in South Africa. There's definitely a lot of pressure to decarbonize from an aging coal fleet into further renewable and sustainable technologies. So some of that is similar to the transitions talks that we see in other parts of the world. But in Africa overall, overarchingly, especially sub-Saharan Africa, if you see the emissions output, and Romy had alluded to this earlier, so the emissions in Africa are 2.5% of the global emissions, and half of those are from South Africa. So we're talking really about like 1 point something global emissions contribution in the rest of Africa. And the transitions there are very different, right? A lot of it is still about energy access, about building infrastructure. Now, also just referring to Romy's points, yes, the COP is about ambition, but not just about the temperature goal. So the adaptation goal often gets overlooked, and the NDC have clearly an adaptation component in it. And given that the attention always comes to emissions reduction, the calculation of like what emissions reductions need to be, there's a lot of like research and math around that, and that absorbs a lot of the intellectual capital in the climate space. Whereas the adaptation goal, we don't really know, and it's how to even quantify a lot of these adaptation actions and how they actually lead up to the adaptation goal. And that is then the question of the African agenda in there often then overlooks the need for infrastructure. And often that ends up in two separate conversations then. So the one is the adaptation conversation that happened in the COP for the political reasons, but then the energy conversations for Africa and that broader infrastructure conversations happen in different fora. So there's this kind of like not very healthy disconnect between climate policy and energy policy. If you talk climate policy in Africa, you don't talk about emissions, you talk about adaptation. If you want to talk energy, you talk about energy security, but you carefully avoid the emissions part of it. So, sadly, that's kind of like become the reality, and that then also impacts on what we will see in the COP, because we will basically look into these transitions in the adaptation space more than anything, and then focusing very much on finance. So what I think actually, if we're thinking about transitions, we need to think across adaptation mitigation. I don't think that is a very helpful separation anymore. I think we're beyond that, So if we're thinking about developmental and infrastructural needs, we see, still about 3/4 of adult livelihoods still depend on agricultural activities on the continent. With changing rainfall patterns, a lot of these livelihoods will have to change, adapt in some ways. We still see urbanization. Paces of urbanization may have changed and slowed down a bit, but we still see a lot of growth of the urban spaces, and that goes beyond electricity infrastructure. It's a lot of climate sensitive services that we will need in terms of water supply, sanitation, waste removal. All of these are climate sensitive services where we need a lot of investment and new technologies. And all of these transitions towards innovating, using new technologies, but also adapting what we have, then actually need to be carefully adjusted in the ways that the people who are going to use them will actually use them, that the people who are going to use them can create them, can actually build livelihoods in creating, innovating, selling these technologies, because there's a lot of the knowledge sits in the people and on the continent. So it's not all about like importing or technology transfer and all of that. It's more about enabling and leveraging what's already there. The technologies are pretty much available. They've become affordable. So it's more about like making that work and having a community thrive and engage on what it is that they need and how they actually make that technological change happen for them. So that's kind of like my take on the transitions question, which I think often gets overlooked in terms of the detail, the actors, the users, and the institutions that we need to help enable the technological change that's looming in order to secure energy supply, but also in order to adapt to the impacts of climate change.
Fantastic. Dr. Renkamp, thank you so much for your contribution. It's actually a very useful segue into what Dr. Nicholas King would have likely spoken about. And that is, from what I recall in my conversations with Prof. King, he emphasizes what he calls safe fail infrastructure. And the imagery that stuck with me was, he said, look, when you're in a war, you build bridges that you can fold out across a swelling river and fold back and use them at the next stop, or leave them in a safe place for when they need to be used. And we need to start thinking in those kind of terms. Or why are we building massive hydropower electric dams when we know that damming rivers is very unhelpful for some of our adaptation requirements? And why are we not rather engaging in micro solar grids and using new technology that is at our disposal to adapt, and really focusing on adaptation? I'd like to, on that note, just open up the conversation a little bit. and an audience, please, thank you so much for joining us. We've got 77 people listening in, and so we've got some questions coming in from the audience, which I'll take, and just to get us going, I'm going to ask a question. Romy, maybe I can start with you. One of the difficulties that tends to arise at COP is different negotiating strengths, and the feeling that Africa often comes away from the negotiations not actually having achieved what it requires, which raises this question of collective action at the global level. How do we actually secure the trillions that we need, never mind the 100 billion that has been committed? Is there a device at the global level that is necessary to really make the biggest emitters commit, both to mitigation and finance, that will help those who bear the brunt of climate change effects to actually do what's necessary to adapt? And maybe you could speak to that. One of the things you mentioned, Romy, was the need to speak as a bloc and to actually ensure that our NDCs at each country level are legislated so that they're not merely voluntary. Of course, some of the pushback to that is that at the global level, these commitments are voluntary. And of course, maybe precisely because they've been voluntary and there hasn't really been a deterrence mechanism for non-adherence to commitments, that's why we've seen so little progress until now. Maybe you could just give us some of your insights on those issues, and then we'll move the conversation forward.
Okay, it's a difficult question. I mean, I think a lot of people try and grapple with how to make better progress at the COPs because nothing is really binding, and that's the problem. And historically, we've seen countries coming in and out of the negotiations, pulling back commitments. We still see countries. They're obvious major emitters that we're still waiting for commitments from. We have an intention from China, we have an intention from the US, but there's a lot of countries at this COP that people are waiting to see what are they. I mean, India is the one in point. I mean, there's many where we say, we're still waiting on them for an ambitious commitment of sorts. And there are also countries, for example, that have made some form of pledge, but we can see that they're not becoming increasingly progressive. Or some countries, for example, that are more progressive in terms of financing. So some countries have signaled that they might, give more. So Germany, US have signaled that they might give more climate finance, but others. I don't really want to mention them, but there's many obvious ones that kind of are just stuck in the mud and non-progressive, which is a very difficult in terms of negotiations, because unless you have the major key emitters on board and making just and equitable commitments, then it's really difficult specifically to get other developing countries on board. And there is that obvious tension between the developed and the developing countries, which are meant to be kind of on par. Everybody is meant to commit at the moment, albeit differently. But then there's this question around the middle income countries. So questions the BRICS countries and how their contributions are to be fair and equitable. And I think it is a very difficult question. There are a couple of mechanisms in play, but it is very, very difficult. I mean, there's big questions around carbon markets at the moment, and countries trying to secure income from something that's a little bit more predictable in terms of financing, and all these other things around how to secure kind of the burden share. I mean, how do you divide up? Even at the Africa level, there's question marks around what countries. Britta has clearly said South Africa has a huge emissions profile in terms of a continental breakdown. Is it then up to South Africa to compensate other African countries while South Africa can talk about its just transition and the need for space and time, et cetera, et cetera. So these issues are very, very difficult. One thing that I can say that is at least positive is that there's massive momentum both at the government level in terms of citizens' awareness and interest in these issues and pressure from sort of outside and external actors, and then also people understanding that this is a kind of all of society and collective responses needed in order to meet what we need. So it's outside only of government stakeholders. So we're looking at the private sector, we're looking at all forms of players to get on board and make pledges. So these decarbonization plans are beyond what country, beyond country commitments now. We're looking at all sorts of actors, and there's lots of discussions around race to net zero, et cetera, et cetera. Whether they're ambitious enough, no, they're not. But we're hoping, and maybe it's just the optimist in me that, slowly there will be progress made. And I think the stark reality that these impacts are happening now, and they are, that they are going to increase and intensify, and the implications on our societies are going to be drastic, has hit home for many countries, especially as they experience drought, fires, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just trying to remember, African Union, Africa member countries have obviously different interests and different. So there's obviously a negotiating process that happens on the continental level, and it's a kind of a multitude of different bodies that are also negotiating. One thing you asked initially was around capacity. I mean, having the African Union intentional strategy is one thing. Implementation happens at a national level. And not only at a national level, within our national structures, there's obviously implementing agents that are key to making sure that these things happen on the ground. Local governments, municipalities, et cetera, who are at the face of these climate change challenges on a daily basis. And then, as Prabhat mentioned, the capacity constraints related to kind of the actual implementation capacity to actually perform what they're needed to do. And there's major issues around that. And then obviously financial requirements to do all of these things. But it is not an equal society. And it is a very, very challenging task. One which I'm hoping many more people are paying attention to, and hopefully, the mechanisms and the penalties and things are in play now to penalize those that are not moving. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, fantastic, Romy. Thank you. And it raises this question in something that you mentioned around carbon pricing that I wanted to pick up on. There's a fantastic piece by William Nordice in Foreign Affairs just from last week, if I remember correctly. And he was arguing that we need to see collective action. So there needs to be sufficient deterrence for emitters who don't come to the party to actually come to the party and commit. We then need to see proper carbon pricing as a means of getting production and consumption patterns to change. And of course, in that, and Prabhat, I wonder if I could come to you on this. One of the conversations around adaptation is valuing our landscapes more fruitfully, more realistically. So, for instance, we know, and the evidence is very clear, that intact ecological landscapes are really important for both mitigation, but we talk less about how they're important for adaptation. So maybe you could talk to us a bit about the importance of valuing landscapes more accurately, so as to incentivize their preservation as a means of both mitigating and adapting to climate change.
Thanks. So it's not my expertise, but I'll try my best. So I think we just have to rewind the clocks by a year and a half when we were in lockdown, and then suddenly everybody became sort of aware of that the nature is not out there. It's actually in our. It can thrive in our towns also, provided we give it some respite, right? And I think a lot of us started to had that experience for the first time, listening to the birds, or in my native country, like, animals on the streets, which many generations had not seen, or being able to see Himalayas from 400 kilometers far away, right? And then rejoicing on that, given that the air quality in much of the North India is pretty bad. So the importance of valuing landscape, I don't think so. There's this notion that what you can't put a price on, you can't really value. I think it has its limits. So the value of having landscape there, I think there's a limit to how much we can value. There is some economic cost which we can factor in, but there are a lot of socio-ecological costs which we are unable to factor in, precisely because the interconnections between the systems are still beyond the human capacity to grapple with, right? So so even like very recently now we are starting to realize how trees communicate with each other, right? they transfer if one tree is dying, how they transfer the nutrients to the rest, so that the forest lives on even if the tree dies, right? Whereas if you look at the human world and how we are approaching the negotiations, it's like the national interest, right? So it's not, we don't see ourselves as forest, we see ourselves as individual trees, and that is reflected in how we have made our society like individually, right? That individual, and we've. So I think maybe I'm going very way off with what you asked, but the point being that the value of adaptation has, as Britta also mentioned, that a lot of the time the narrative has been on mitigation, and it's precisely because one, the impact of mitigation efforts can be global. So wherever you reduce emission, it affects. But adaptation is very context specific, right? It's very local. So you need local ownership. You need to build that kind of, that identity almost, in a sense that, that this is our hood, so to say, if I can use that framing, to build that. And that the value of adaptation, I don't think so can be measured at a global scale. The value of adaptation has to be localized in the local context.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you so much, Prabhat, for not being an expert. That was exactly the kind of direction in which I was looking to take the conversation. And so on this question of adaptation, then still, Dr. Renkamp, I wonder if I could come to you and maybe if you could just expand for us, something you said really struck me, that climate and energy politics and policies are often divorced, and that actually we need to really integrate these, if I understood you correctly. And in the process of just talking us through that, you also spoke about some of the new technologies that are available and are at our disposal to really meet some adaptation requirements. Maybe you could expand on that for us and what they might look like. I ask that question in part because another thing that's emerging from the global discussion is that there have to be incentives into research and development, and we need to incentivize adaptation rather than expecting that adaptation is just going to be a kind of crisis response, so that there can be real economic value in adaptation that isn't necessarily, but that in fact is not environmentally destructive.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, I can give you some examples. I see that adaptation and development / energy mitigation space is growing a lot if you think of the challenge, right? So if we think of the challenge for Africa now is sustainable urbanization, right? So more people grow up into the cities, and you don't want just an expansion of slums, which is what you're heading to if you continue with equally unequal societies as you see them right now, right? So the ones have, the other ones don't. So there's a question of like how you provide public goods. At the moment, there aren't that many, so a lot of the actually redistributive mechanisms don't work. The rich can make a plan because they can buy, they have capital to make private plans. The poor will be left behind. So now, if you think of examples for technology in building sustainable cities, for example, it's how to build houses, right? So firstly, flooding problems usually just are man-made because nature doesn't create flooding. The water will absorb. It's badly built infrastructure. So that needs to be acknowledged first. Then there's a lot of potential you can build from, the same house as you build from brick, you can build from sandbags, and it'll be more resilient to flooding issues. The same for sanitation. There's a lot potential for more water-wise sanitation that actually doesn't need that much infrastructure in terms of piping materials. There's in the agricultural space, there are a lot of potential for solar-powered irrigation, so that you don't depend on transmission lines. You can just create your own little solar power. Solar pumping for groundwater. So there's a lot of that interface really that is small scale, and as it's small scale, it can also be incentivized as such as small scale. It doesn't necessarily need like the big coal plant. And then the other issue around these large scale infrastructural project, they're often very vulnerable to rent seeking,
Yes.
you know, and so the more decentralized infrastructure that people can own, look after, and use by themselves, the more of an incentive there is to actually make sure that it works. There's less vandalism. It's been proved there's better usage of these technologies. Same for, you know, waste. There's so much potential in the circular economy, job creation, a lot of it that's been underutilized. Currently, I mean, coming to South Africa is drowning in waste, you know. Landfill is very harmful to the environment. So there are a lot of these actually urban services that can be reorganized in ways that they create jobs and that they actually build more sustainable environments for people to live in harmony with the environment.
Yeah, fantastic, Britta. Thank you so much. So, of course, this raises a question around political will. But the first thing I want to do, and perhaps I'm off point here, but there's a question about how we persuade governments who benefit from the rents associated with mega projects to actually see the benefits of decentralized power provision, new technologies that can help us to solve some of our serious problems and that can create food security and more sustainable urbanization and so on. So how do we persuade those who, for instance, benefit from the building of a big coal-fired power station or a big dam, that actually this is ultimately self-destructive? And related to that question, I wanted to ask Romy whether the NDCs are a potential opportunity to build this kind of thinking into. And there's a question from the audience around whether NDCs are legally binding. I think you did make the point that in order for them to gain traction, they probably need to be. And I may be off, but is there a way for us to incorporate some of these imperatives that Britta is speaking about into our NDCs? And Britta, maybe just to start with you though, before we move to Romy, how do we persuade those who benefit from rents associated with climate destructive projects to engage in a new trajectory?
Well, that's a tough one. I think you need to create rents and opportunities in sustainable technologies. And given the prices, that's quite easy actually to do. The problem is really to let go of the current rents that are still there. Like look at the coal sector in South Africa. It's so like built into the political economy that it's like hard to let go of that. And that's actually where international dynamics and pricing can play a role. I'm not a big fan of William Nordhaus to admit, because I don't think you can price everything. And we landed with a lot of pricing, like American type thinking pricing, and, you know, like the clean development mechanism, a lot of the pricing stuff kind of like shaped climate negotiations in ways that weren't healthy, you know, so, and that actually didn't work out. Also the trading systems and all of that didn't really help that much. But I think in terms of exiting unsustainable technologies and fossil fuels particularly, we can now see that the current dynamics in coal can put a cap on the use of coal and can actually also help South Africa to exit in a, you know, an organized transition from their coal dependence. And I think that's the way to basically re-channel rents into more sustainable technologies. And then if you can do that gradually, that they are inclusive, I think it's just you need to build the institutional capacity so that the rents from new technologies actually don't just land overseas, but that they can also be used in the local economy across the board. And I think especially renewables are really flexible in being able to do this, because you can build them large scale, you can use them very small scale, you can use them for all the different ways if you wanted to integrate them with the grid or not. And I think all of this can happen. And just a very small note on the NDCs, I think what's also important is that the NDCs are such a just becoming more open for people to understand what they are and more inclusive in terms of participation. And I think that's something that needs to be advanced as the COPs and the global stock takes and all of that emerges, so that they're not just a little tick box send off to the, to the convention, but that they're really like in a process where people understand what they actually mean for their livelihoods. Yeah.
Yes, brilliant. Thank you so much, Britta. I really appreciate that. We're going to come back, I think, to this question of pricing everything. Prabhat also mentioned that there's an extent to which trying to put a price on everything as a means of incentivizing right behavior may not be the most adequate solution. I'd love to get back to that. But something you said really struck me, that there's real opportunity in new technologies to create more equally distributed rents. And there are opportunities for knowledge and technical skills transfer. And there are opportunities to tap into global value chains and to manufacture locally, which we really don't seem to be tapping into as yet. Romy, this question of the NDCs, can they serve as a vehicle for trying to meet some of these things that we've been talking about? And maybe you could just expand on this question around them kind of becoming legalized as a means of kind of avoiding our propensity to ignore voluntary initiatives.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. And it's a great question. And if I just go back a little bit in just for the benefit of the audience, these were mechanisms that were described under the Paris Agreement back in 2015, and they essentially were to look at, actually, mainly most of them look at the mitigation questions, but increasingly they've been asked to include resilience building and adaptation priorities. And the idea is that there was obviously difficult political discussions around how to divide this climate burden and how to distribute what is needed in terms of science. So essentially, these NDCs are nationally determined plans. So as the name suggests, they're self-determined in terms of countries decide, okay, this is what I'm going to do to 2030 to meet the climate crisis, to look at vulnerability issues, capacity issues, everything that we're discussing here. So the idea is that they are the national plan towards this kind of climate pathway to 2030. And as I mentioned, they're the stepping stones to a much longer term timeframe. So they set us up to kind of meet these much longer term decarbonization goals. And they show us how we're going to get there and what type of mechanisms and tools and sectors are on board and what's kind of needed. So the idea is that, yes, they are meant to incorporate, they're a national plan. So the idea is that they incorporate all existing policies and plans and frameworks under one roof and essentially say, this is the country's national plan on how to go forward. What you'll see in terms of progress is some countries have tabled them. So South Africa tabled ours with Cabinet very recently before COP26, which shows obviously an enhanced kind of commitment from a legal perspective. Yet what would happen is that at the climate change bill level and other legislation, the same principles and the same kind of transition mechanisms need to be reflected throughout all actions. So with the decarbonization plans for 2050, they're going to be much more detailed, much more in depth, much more economy-wide, where they show very much around how we're going to get there and what we're going to do to decarbonize by 2050. But these are kind of the interim steps of how to do that. Everybody's meant to be on board. As Britta mentioned, they are meant to be inclusive frameworks so that all of society is meant to be involved in their development. So in some countries have made a lot more progress in terms of making sure that there are stages for inclusion in the policy processes where gender, youth, and farmers, whatever, can get involved, write submissions, participate in the actual development and design of these NDCs. As we mentioned, they are meant to progress. Every 5 years, they're meant to show increasing ambition. So they are not meant to be set in time. They are meant to be up to date with science, up to date with technology advances, et cetera, et cetera. And they're also meant to be reviewed so that we can see that cumulatively all these NDCs add up to what is needed by in terms of the science at the global level. So they are contributions to the global goal, yet they're self-determined. So yes, they are vehicles for transformation, for progressive action, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that probably answers. I hope that's good.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Romy. I think there can often be a lot of reluctance around some of the technicalities. So thank you so much for just explaining in very layman's but understandable terms what NDCs are, what they're meant to achieve. I want to bring the conversation back to Prabhat for a second on the back of something that Britta alerted me to, and that is we tend to see a lot of corporates trying to offset their carbon guilt, as it were, through planting trees. Now, part of the issue with that is that it looks like we're creating green deserts, and a lot of the trees that we plant to assuage our guilt end up going up in smoke precisely because of climate change and exacerbating rather than solving the problem. So that raises a question of how we incentivize firms to engage in carbon offsetting exercises that are far more ecologically sustainable. Do you have any thoughts for us on how we might incentivize forest or landscape restoration, perhaps rather than simply planting trees?
Yeah, so I think important to recognize that planting trees is no substitution for, you can't substitute a forest by planting trees, right? So a forest is a complex system that has evolved over time. But so let's say for an comparison basis, you ended up for a development project, you ended up clearing a patch of land where there was a forest, which was, let's say, 50, 60, 100 years old, and it had networks within, right? But the argument is that there are 100 trees in that forest, we are going to plant 1,000 trees elsewhere, right? And an example would be, if you look at our legal system, that would be like, let's do away with the Supreme Court, but we'll train 1,000 judges. Now, whether those 1,000 judges can replace that Supreme Court, right, in a matter of few years? No, it will take time to reach that level. And I think that's the short-sightedness that we are confusing when we go into the numbers, and we reduce everything to numbers. We start missing out the bigger picture and the deep interconnections which are hidden behind the numbers. So I think it's important to recognize that there's a limit to how much guilt we can offset, and not only of the companies but also individuals, right? That I'm gonna fly to some place, I'll just buy carbon offset. So I think for me, it's like I think we've over-marketized guilt. We need to really tap into other emotions. So guilt is also powerful, but I think it's limited. It comes into effect when the damage has been done. We are at a stage where we can't afford to be guilty anymore, right? We need to start thinking beforehand that how to avoid guilt. And so that's the frame that, what are those emotions you can tap? So that's optimism, but also pessimism in a sense, right? There is the distinction for me between an optimist and pessimist is that pessimist is an informed optimist, right? So if you don't have any information, it's very easy to be optimist. But to maintain a bit of optimism in wake of all the information we are bombarded with, so how do we maintain that and work on that? So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think in terms of incentivizing firms on carbon offsets, I think the carbon offsets need to be limited to certain emissions which are totally unavoidable, that we can't do away with, but not say energy system. So we have alternative for coal, we have alternative for gas, we need to shift away. But the systems where we do not yet have alternatives, their carbon offsets maybe can be used, but we have to make sure that that's not the real action, that there would still be some amount of emissions. So the harder to abate sector or the process emissions. So I think there is a use, but I agree with Britta that it's been oversold for now, and we really need to. That's not the real action. We need to see real actions in terms of actual emission reductions.
Yeah, fantastic. Very, very fruitful answer. Thank you so much, Prabhat. We do, it seems, run the risk of guilt assuaging mechanisms actually not doing enough to limit emissions, which is really what we need to get to, which raises another question from the audience, which was whether our 1.5 degree target above pre-industrial levels is actually realistic. So do we think we're going to get there? So I'd like to just put that to you before I move to a question from the audience, and then we'll move to closing remarks.
I think the window of opportunity to realize that goal is very small and it's shrinking fast. So the real it's very realistic, but the probability is shrinking by the day, if I can put it that way. So and also as the IPCC's report just says that the impact of human impact on environment and emissions is unequivocal, some is unprecedented, and some of it is irreversible, right? That something's going to happen. Only yesterday or day before, there was, I think, a UN has released a report which says that all of the African glaciers, which are 3 glaciers, including Mount Kilimanjaro, will be gone within the next 2 decades by 2040, right? So that's I mean, we don't have many to begin with in the continent, but even those which we have are really threatened by this thing. So I think we have to, and that's where these promises of net zero by 2050, etc., needs to be checked in about. That's fine what you're promising in 2050, but what are you doing now, as in here and now, today, within next month, within next year, within 2 years, and what are your plans for now? So that can't be underemphasized at all.
Yeah, absolutely fantastic. It actually speaks exactly to the question from the audience, and I wonder, Britta and Romy, if you guys would both mind having a go at this. The question reads as follows: It's the entire Apollo project to put a man on the moon cost less than $200 billion. We are spending, as a globe, twice that much every year on climate change. And by the globe's own admission, there's been almost no progress since Kyoto and since the initial kind of attempts to build international consensus. Almost no progress in combating climate change. So provocative question here: has there ever been such massive government expenditure worldwide that has had such minuscule returns on investment, and who is monitoring this? I suppose the follow-on question to that is, what can we do about it? And at this COP, is that question likely to be answered? Britta, do you want to take us away?
Yeah, sure. Tough call. But I think it's really, the climate change discussion can be quite overwhelming. So, it's kind of like this climate change everything discussion, and then you don't know where to start. So I think one really needs to choose their battles. And I think there are also some good news if you look into the coal industry, for example. So if you look at there's a website, it's the Global Coal Plant Tracker, for example. If you look at the recent cancellation of coal plants, there are quite a lot of them, so they're not actually getting finance anymore. So not everywhere, but in large parts, and also in Africa, more of them are being stranded just because they're not viable and renewables are cheaper. So there are some good news. I think the comparison of climate change versus like moon missions or whatever, it's a very focused mission. So it's like a few people, they can focus on the one thing. So in a way, you need to disentangle the climate change challenge into man to the moon missions so that you can do them bit by bit. And I think it's also part of the awareness raising. People often get overwhelmed with climate change. They still confuse climate and weather, and they understand the recycling and the plastic, because that kind of like communication of the plastic challenge has been quite successful. It's not going to actually probably going to make that much of an impact in terms of emissions reductions, but it's something that people can action. And I think that's where we need to get to. We need to disentangle the climate change challenge to actionable, large-scale action that people can actually manage and implement. So we can't leave it to the negotiations. They won't solve it. But we've seen it. We can't leave it to all the different industries because they got their own logic of making money. So it's a challenge that needs to be broken down to like basically the world population and do it bit by bit. And that's the only way to do it. And everyone needs to play their part. Unfortunately, that's my answer.
Brilliant. We'll need to get on our bicycles and stop flying around and use less water and so on. Romy.
Yeah, I mean, I think Britta's answered it well. Just to quickly go back to the 1.5 and what this means. I mean, what's quite nice is the science is available now. It shows the recent reports coming out from the IPCC show very specifically what this all looks like in terms of temperature targets, where we're at, are we going to meet it? And is it likely we meet 1.5? I don't know. As Prabhat said, it's becoming increasingly unlikely. They're showing now that we will reach 1.5 already by 2040. Unless there's urgent action taken by everyone, as Britta mentioned. This is a collective issue, and the implications are far-reaching, especially for the continent of Africa and people that are dependent for their livelihoods on natural resources. I mean, they're showing Southern Africa this because obviously there's the effects of climate change are distributed unevenly, but Southern Africa is due to rise between 3 and 5 degrees, which will have massive implications across societies, people, biodiversity, etc. So, and just general well-being, livelihoods and well-being, already exacerbating the development challenges that we are already facing. The financial issue is a massive one. I'm really hoping that something will be put on the table, that people will meet the financial targets. I mean, they're looking at $8.8 trillion to meet what is needed for the NDCs to be implemented. So these are massive amounts of money. But I'm hoping that, I mean, if all the NDCs are on board, people are implementing them, they are ambitious, et cetera, it will make a massive difference. So I think holding governments to account, doing our own individual parts, making sure business is on board, it's a responsibility of everybody. We all are impacting the environment, and we all have therefore a role to play. And I'm just hoping that COP26, the advocacy groups are loud, that citizens are asking governments questions, et cetera. So, and that there will be some progress made.
Fantastic, yeah. Which reminds me of a point that Anthony Downs made in what I think is a landmark article in 1972 called Up and Down with Ecology, where he said, often when there's a problem of this nature, we have public alarm, and then everyone says, we must do something about this. And Britta, to your point, in this case, it seems kind of abstract. We know it's a big problem. We don't really understand the direct, concrete implications of it. And then, of course, when we realize that there's a cost to our own way of living and that we have to change our patterns of consumption in order to drive sometimes patterns of production, we see progress slowing. And so this important point, Romy, that we all have to take collective responsibility for the condition that we're in, and we only have one planet. Prabhat makes the point in the chat that $200 billion US dollars in the 60s and 70s, given inflation, is worth trillions today. And Romy's just made the point that we do need trillions to make the necessary adaptations and investments in research and development, and to stop doing things that actually don't make that much difference and really do things that have kind of big bang for buck. Another question from the audience was, how do we avoid a situation of net zero blah blah, as Greta Thunberg so eloquently put it. And so on that note, perhaps I could ask each of you for your closing remarks, just to take us home. Yeah, how do we avoid another talk shop? And from your perspectives, what would success for Africa look like at COP26? What would it look like for Africa to come away from COP26 having really succeeded in the negotiations? You have touched on some of those issues already, but I think it would be useful if each of you could just take just under 5 minutes, give us your closing thoughts in that respect. Prabhat, I wonder if we could start with you, sir.
Thanks, Remy. I think firstly on the question of how do we avoid blah, 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 I think, so it's the important thing is I think we need to strengthen the accountability regime. We need to push for the transparency in the process, how the decisions are taken, what are the investment choices that are available. And so to build foster an environment of accountability. So then I would just plug in one of the projects that we are leading with the wider civil society in South Africa, with Institute for Economic Justice and SACAN, is looking at exactly that question, that we don't want to treat individuals as consumers anymore. We want to look at them as citizens so that they start thinking of having voice in the overall national policy processes. So I think that's an important piece of the puzzle, that how do you build in accountability regime and transparency in the process so that, it's not limited to elite circles and few people in the webinars like these that, so that's one. On your question of what would be success for Africa, I think one aside for me is that we do not end up with a process which is totally up in bits and pieces. So that is an important part. So I think to have a bit of we come out of this whole process, and it's a meta point, come out of this process with trust enhanced in the process rather than coming out suspicious of each other's intention. So because that will drive what happens next. If countries are not cooperating, as we've seen with COVID response, right, and that can easily seep into other policy issues. So I think that's a bigger challenge, that the impact will be on Africa. If you look at COVID, few countries went by national interest, and we in Africa were left with very few vaccines, right? So in that sense, it's in our interest that we find ways to fuse in trust into the process, build bridges, etc. So that's one. But on the more material level, I think ensuring that developed countries go beyond $100 billion, as Remy rightly pointed out, the needs are in trillions, and what we are negotiating and spending so much energy is on few billions. That just doesn't fit well. So that's that deep disconnect which is there, which needs to be addressed. And then finally is the political will in the process. So if you have few countries, including the US president, coming to the venue to talk, but if you do not have some Xi Jinping and Putin in the same venue, what are the chances of reaching an agreement realistically, right? And with whom are you going to negotiate in that sense? So I think those are the incoherences in the process that we really need to figure a way out to get over to ensure that we have a better ground when we start preparing for COP27 in Africa. Thanks.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you, Prabhat. So maybe just before we close out here, there's a question I want to add to all of you, just to bring in the last questions from the audience. They always come in at the end. What would South Africa spend its first billion on? Okay, so what does success look like? Prabhat, you've answered that brilliantly. I really appreciate your insights and inputs there. From a local perspective, what should South Africa spend its first billion on? Let's say we get the money. What do we do to help save the environment and stop or adapt at least?
I think not on infrastructure, but on systems which build in institutional capacity and transparency in the system. Because the biggest challenge with South Africa is we spend a lot of time in planning, and we have good policies. I'm not talking of ambition, I'm talking of policies per se. They are very sophisticated. Ambition is not up there, but sophistication is there. But when it comes to actually implementing them, on delivering them, we fail miserably. So I think systems to ensure or enhancing institutional capacity so that we actually deliver on what we promise. I think for me, that will be money well spent. Thanks.
Brilliant. And it's a good start. It all starts with having the right systems in place. So fantastic. All right, Britta, I wonder if I could just jump to you for your closing remarks and this $1 billion question. Not a $1 million question, but a $1 billion question.
Yeah, thanks so much. So first on the remarks, I think the risk of no success would be if we continue with the same as usual. African negotiators shying away from the energy and the emissions intensive questions. The ambition questions actually not being tackled, which is very likely to happen. It won't be actually a renegotiation of ambition. I put it in the chat, the emissions gap report came out yesterday and put us with the current NDCs on 2.7 degrees warming. So, I think the countries could actually go back and revise their emissions down, their targets down. But I think that's very unlikely to happen. So success would if that ambition question would be tackled in the COP as a negotiation matter. And if there would be parties who would set a precedent and say, look, we're doing this, given this, and then there might be others who follow. But I think it's quite unlikely. That's for the COP. I think for Africa, the best would be if African leaders, governments, and society would get onto their own feet and understand that there's nothing to expect from the negotiations, so that actually the finance and the innovation and the ideas and the action needs to come from themselves, because these dependencies are not healthy, and it's kind of like a hangover of the past. And, you know, those actual donor agencies are now fishing for the climate finance. They have their own little ecosystems that they're serving. Yeah, let's face it, there's not much to come for African people. It's like creates more job for aid workers and UNDP and all of them, with all my respect to the work, but that's like kind of like a built-in principal agent problem into the aid industry. Okay, principal agent is kind of like the question of who's the dog and who's the tail, like who's the client, and, you know, and it's not like really the people. It's often like those who sit in the agencies, even though with good intentions. I'm not blaming anybody, but I think that's part of it. And I think the third point would be to not let go of the NDCs, you know, build institutional capacity, build institutional structures that make sure that the NDCs don't go to sleep again. And in 4 years' time, we're like, oh, the NDCs, we're going to be woken up again. So the NDCs shouldn't be a surprise to anyone anymore. You know, we've done it now. We know it works. They're not going to go away. A colleague of mine in Ghana, we've been working with on the NDCs, to put it like that, like you're not going to train for the Olympics 6 months before, right? It's like an ongoing exercise, and that's kind of somehow something that we need to get to. And then I think the last point is the notion of 2 negotiation tables, you know. There's a paper that puts that together. The one is the international negotiation, and obviously it comes with its own little ecosystem there, and demands and norms and language and all of that. But the other one is the domestic one, and often there's a lot of disintegration between those 2 negotiation tables. And I think it's really comes back to the honesty of understanding what the own contribution can actually be, rather than what's expected in the international domain. I think it's a sideshow to the climate challenge. It's very important to have it. We should try and do our best to support it, but the action comes down to the ground, and that's what needs to be within the people's domain, and each one of us really. The $1 million question is for South Africa. Revive the RI4P. We haven't built anything really. We need to put it together. The renewable energy program, it's there, it's functional. The industries are here, they're ready to shoot. We can have solar, large-scale solar up in 6 months running. Use part of it for good pension for Gwede Mantashe and his crew. Just put them somewhere nice so that they take their fingers away from the coal contracts and just get that program running. It's there, the infrastructure, everything is there. We can get this done quite easily.
Brilliant. That's super helpful. Yeah, I think that the paper to which you're referring, Britta, if I'm not wrong, is by Putnam, 1988, 2-level games. Yeah, brilliant.
Precisely.
Brilliant.
Well read.
No,
yeah.
I'll share it on the chat. Good reference. Amazing how prescient it still is. You know, quite a few years later, 33 years later. Romy, could we close with you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think Britta eloquently spoke about the first South African billion rand or dollars. Yeah, we've got to address our mitigation issues and our energy shortage issues, which you can do together. And then hopefully, if there's some money left over, it would be to assist communities with their resilience against the impacts, and doing this using, you know, social safety nets and other mechanisms to ensure that their quality of life is not deteriorating. What would a successful COP look like? I'm hoping that obviously collective action we've discussed, commitments and implementation. So from this whole intentions to actions thing, and specifically looking at what exists on the table, NDCs are there. A lot of the NDCs are being criticized because they are not showing the ambition that's needed in terms of the long-term trajectory. So, for example, China's trajectories, the intermediate goals are not showing the right ambition. So making sure that it's aligned for our 2050 ambition, making sure that we are implementing and doing what we've said is key to this whole thing. Obviously, a successful COP for Africa would be see the delivery of climate finance equitably, fairly, etc., etc. So hopefully that is resolved. It's a big elephant in the room, and then to hope that trust is not entirely destroyed, so that the conversation is still going on and that people are still at the table. And I think a lot of frustration, well, a lot of where we have seen the negotiations break down in the past is where countries remove themselves from the conversation. So hoping that is still intact, and that African group employs their agency, and that they negotiate hard for the developing countries, and specifically for the most vulnerable countries and for the most vulnerable groupings, which include our youth, which include gender, and other disenfranchised people. So yeah, I hope that the solution that comes out is fair and equitable. So that would be my hope.
Brilliant. Romy, Britta, Prabhat, thank you so much. All of you have provided fantastic insights. You've complemented one another in very fruitful ways. To the audience who've joined us and stayed with us, to all 75 of you, we really appreciate your time. We think that there couldn't be a more important conversation. Climate change is the single biggest issue facing the globe, and especially Africa, because we are going to bear the brunt of us not realizing a below 1.5 degree warming above pre-industrial levels. On that note, I would like to invite you all, please, to join our Wicked conversation. I'll post a link on the group where we're writing constantly about what's expected at COP26, some of the multifaceted problems and the interdisciplinary solutions that have been put on the table here today, the importance of really getting cracking with renewables, building the systemic and institutional capacity to get there, and ensuring that the most vulnerable are actually really well looked after in this process. So again, thank you for your time. We really appreciate it, and well done everyone, especially to our speakers. If we were in the room, we could give them a round of applause, but we're really grateful. Please do also give us your feedback on how we could do better in these webinars. But to our speakers, thank you. To our audience, thank you. Have a wonderful evening. Bye everyone.